Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me well. I'm sorry for the slight delay in the start of our event, and I hope we have some more people attending us in the course of it. But I do not want to make you wait any longer and welcome you, of course, to our event today. So the event is entitled "Is Academic Freedom in Europe Decided in Beijing?" And first of all, I want to give you a brief introduction as to how we came to organize this event. So first of all, I'm a postdoctoral researcher. My name is Catherine van de Graaf, and I work at the Academy of European Human Rights Protection in Cologne. And we've had a lecture series at the Academy together with the Institute of International Peace and Security Law for the past semester, where we organize all kinds of lectures on academic freedom. At the same time, I'm also a coach of a migration and human rights law legal clinic at the University of Ghent. And I'm supervising or coaching a group of students, master students, who are writing a report within the framework of the Universal Periodic Review of China. And they're writing this report together with scholars at risk. So the focus of this report is on academic freedom. And it is actually through these students that the idea came up to organize this event on China. So maybe as some of you know, Scholars at Risk is an NGO that reports how academics throughout the world are limited in their freedom of speech and in their academic freedom. And as an NGO, Scholar at Risk tries to advocate for their rights when it goes really wrong and people are persecuted and so on. But they also try to raise awareness on the theme of academic freedom. And so the students draft a report in which they signal the manners in which China maybe does not fulfill all the standards it should fulfill to be in accordance with the treaties and so on it has signed, in which it confirms it supports academic freedom. So while the students were focusing on academic freedom within the territory of China, and they brought up a lot of ways in which this is violated and individual cases of people who are the target of the Chinese Communist Party, they also signaled that there seems to be an issue with people who cannot attend. People who cannot leave the waiting.
I'm actually leaving them in, so usually should work. At least those who weren't let in are here.
Okay, now everyone is inside? Okay. I do not know what I was saying at sorry. So while they were bringing to the forefront what was happening inside of China, they also signaled that there was this extraterritorial impact as well. So what does this mean? That the Chinese Communist Party or the central government in Beijing is in a way able to also have an impact on academic freedom outside of its borders. And the tactics that are used to do this are very similar to the tactics that are used within the territory. So using kind of different pressure mechanisms so that scholars would self-censor, so that students are not able to obtain certain information and so on. But it's of course very interesting that it's able to do that also outside of this, its own territory. And this is something that is possible through different kind of mechanisms, about which we will of course hear a lot more from our guests that I will introduce in a little bit. But one of the central mechanisms there is what is called the Hong Kong National Security Law. And especially Article 38 of that specific law kind of allows to, I would say threaten, but also arrest if they would enter the territory of China when they have criticism on the CCP. So it's a very, for the non-lawyers who are present, it's a very distinct way of having this extraterritorial effect of a law on events that happen outside of the country. And it's something we will probably come back to as well. But this law is something, there's already different scholars who have been feeling the consequences of this specific law after having criticized the CCP in past years. And one of these scholars is or might be Professor Andreas Fulda, who is here with us today as a guest, as a speaker. I'm very excited to introduce him to all of you because I'm very excited to hear him speak as well. So Professor Fulda, for the past so many years, has been focusing as a political scientist on China, also as a China scholar. He has a keen interest in philosophy of science, which is something we might end up talking about a little bit towards the end of our talk today. And for the past 20 years, he has been studying the 4 research strands of democratization studies, EU-China relations, citizen diplomacy, and academic freedom. And he has applied this research to bridge gaps between the British, German, and European China policy. He has, of course, published in very interesting and peer-reviewed academic journals. And he is also currently working on a book that will bring this relation to the forefront. At the same time, he has commented in outside of academia in newspapers such as The Guardian, The Independent, The Spectator, and so on. And he has also fulfilled positions as a sort of an advisor or shared his experience through testimony in all kinds of organizations, such as the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Foreign Affairs Committee, the Royal Military College of Canada, and so on. So Professor Fulda is really someone who has tried to put his knowledge to be available to as many people as possible. And so I want to welcome you again, Professor Fulda, to be present here with us today and also make time for us. So before I will sketch a little bit how this lecture today will take place, I will give you a few disclaimers before we start. Then Professor Fulda will explain a little bit the main ideas you need to have about this topic, so that the background knowledge is a little bit there. And then we will go on as sort of a conversation is more the idea of the event. So this means that I will be asking questions as some kind of moderator host, but that means that, of course, you can also ask questions. You can ask questions, but you can also have comments. So please do this in a respectful way, of course, but please use the chat. 2 students of the University of Ghent, Kawar and Francois, they will be manning the chat and bringing up questions that come from the people who are attending. But if for some way it doesn't get noticed, feel free to switch off your microphone and speak up. All opinions are welcome, again, if they are formulated in a friendly manner. So I want to give you a few disclaimers maybe before we start. So first of all, I want to say that, and we try to be particular about this by choosing the title, Is Academic Freedom in Europe Decided in Beijing? When we talk about China, and we will sometimes use the term China, this is not meant to cover Chinese people or the Chinese culture, because a lot of the themes that we will be discussing today are really out of the hands of people who would try to influence that, even out of the hands of critical voices in China. We are talking about the Chinese Communist Party and the central government, and that's why we use the term Beijing in the name of our event. A second disclaimer I want to give is that most of the discussion we will be having today is much more based on arts and humanities and social sciences. So we are much less having a debate about more STEM kind of research, because of also the content of that kind of debate will be a lot different. So then we will be talking more about the dual use of certain scientific research, or about unregulated technology transfer, and that is not so much what we're going to be talking about when we focus on academic freedom today. So I think these are most of the disclaimers I wanted to give. But sure, I think more things will come up as we move through the talk of Professor Fulda. So I want to say, please, the floor is yours. On the next slide, I have I hope everyone can see that. And I'm supposed to have the main figure that is used in this paper written by Andreas Fulda and David Missal that I suggest all of you read, but I think he will probably be talking a little bit more about that as well. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a very generous and very kind introduction, Catherine. It's a real pleasure talking with you and all of the students who are on the call today. In particular, since in a way, although it's virtual, it's a webinar, the University of Cologne, I should say, is my alma mater. And the University of Cologne has given me a lot in terms of my own personal and intellectual growth. And I would hope that by participating in today's event, I will be able to give back a little bit. When we talk about academic freedom, in a way, it's a very specific topic. It's not quite as broad as freedom of speech, which is related, but of course a different topic. And in a nutshell, I think academic freedom is important because it's a specific right that protects the ability of academics to engage in research and teaching without fear of favor and without interference from, let's say, our own institutions or our own government or perhaps foreign governments. And whilst I think we all understand how important academic freedom is, unfortunately, it's not always protected in practice. And so the slide that Catherine kindly put up, you can already see, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, that in the context of Germany or maybe the Netherlands or the UK, we know that populist politicians can be a threat to academic freedom. Or even our own civil society is actually uncivil. Think of, I don't know, flat earthers and COVID deniers and groupings like that, who can actually also question the validity of scientific thought even. Or think of very problematic third-party funding. So let's say in the health sciences, let's say a grant by the tobacco industry comes with a lot of strings attached if, let's say, you're researching cancer. And so that could impact upon academic freedom. But of course, there are also misguided developments within our field. Think of the financialization of higher education, certainly here in the UK, but also increasingly on the European mainland. And for example, the way we're being assessed by KPIs and kind of bringing in a set third-party funds, and all of that can be a problem for academic freedom. Now, I think what is often overlooked is the international dimension. And as a political scientist and China scholar, I will primarily talk about the role of China today. And here I'd like to echo what Catherine just said. I will be very critical. However, it's not a critique of the Chinese people who have no say over the way China is governed. So my criticism is primarily focused on the Chinese Communist Party, or I often use the term the party state. And so perhaps, I mean, I can stop here and we can then perhaps start even our conversation about this kind of intriguing shift from domestic censorship that you already mentioned, but also how it kind of has seeped into the international fora and has become a problem for ourselves. What do you think, Catherine? Should we perhaps start here, or would you like me to carry on? I just don't want to kind of turn this into a monologue.
No, I think you can carry on a little bit, explaining maybe how this occurs.
Okay, I'm happy to.
Within the framework of the figure, because I'm not sure everyone has the same background. So I think a little bit of starting knowledge there would be nice.
Okay, I'm happy to. So perhaps let me explain it this way. China has, of course, evolved over the past decades And especially around the late 1990s, there were great hopes that with WTO accession, China would become more in tune with the international community, would open up, liberalize. Now, this hasn't come to pass, but I think we need to recognize that for a couple of years, China's domestic situation was far more liberal, not liberal in a liberal democratic sense, but let's say semi-liberal. So under General Secretary Hu Jintao, he was at the helm of the party between 2002 and 2012. The space for Chinese academics was bigger. The space for civil society practitioners and critics of the regime was much more big, much more pronounced. There was what could be termed like a gray area that could be exploited. But unfortunately, with the handover to General Secretary Xi Jinping, and from, let's say, 2013 onwards, very early on, it became clear that there would be something of a hard authoritarian turn. So, for example, in 2013, universities received phone calls. These were oral directives, the 7 don't speaks. And university leaders were instructed that universal values were taboo. Civil society and civil rights were taboo. They could no longer use these terms in class. And then in the same year, the document number 9 was leaked. That was a written party directive, and it kind of echoed those themes. So again, universal values, independent journalism, independent judiciary, all of these terms were declared taboo. And this had, of course, then a chilling effect within China. Now, I should say in certain parts of the international community, document number 9 in particular was seen as a major red flag, but not universally. So, for example, in Germany, where I'm from originally, much less attention was paid to this document. But I think if we talked about the Hong Kong National Security Law already, which was promulgated in 2020, and Article 38. Now, this is a really problematic law because it has this extraterritorial provision. Now, it's problematic because this provision, in fact, criminalizes what I do for a living. So I'm an academic, a political scientist, and a China scholar. And of course, I research in a critical way, and I do not hold back in my criticism of, for example, the lack of the democratic political legitimacy of the Communist Party, or I critique certain party policies. Now, under this law, it's fairly vague, but if I was to travel to Hong Kong, and they could arrest me. And this is unfortunately not just a theoretical possibility. So, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, a student from Hong Kong who studied, she studied in Japan. She went back to Hong Kong, I think, to do some paperwork, to renew maybe, I don't know, a document, I understand. And then she was arrested under this national security law. And the charge was that she had posted something on Facebook 2 years ago. Apparently something in favor of Hong Kong independence, perhaps during the popular uprising that, of course, took place in Hong Kong in 2019. So the problem then is, here we have an international student from Hong Kong studying in Japan, posting something on Facebook and returning home and subsequently being arrested. And so this actually, I think, shows how dangerous this law is, because even if sometimes colleagues say, Andreas, that's not going to happen, they will not arrest a German or British or Dutch scholar in Hong Kong. But I don't know. I wouldn't want to test that theory if it was me. And also, of course, the threat in itself is an act of censorship, because it does create an environment of fear. And it means that if you're teaching current Chinese affairs, or you're dealing with topics that relate to China, even you don't have to be a China specialist, but many academic subjects now touch upon China because it's so important in every regard. You may even be unaware that you've been running afoul this Hong Kong national security law. And especially in arts and humanities and the social sciences, if you're a China scholar, of course, you know about it. And this could then trigger self-censorship, either in a conscious way or unconsciously. And maybe here we can start talking, because I think the subject of self-censorship is really interesting and intriguing, but also quite thorny and difficult. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, now everyone can hear me again. How can this still happen after 2 years of COVID? I don't know. Can you still see the slide? No, that's what I intended to do, to delete it. So I just wanted to respond to this. And of course, for other people, you can also jump in if you have anything interesting to say, or even uninteresting, you can always jump in. With regards to the self-censorship, I would like to ask you perhaps, could you then maybe discuss with us, as an expert in this field, what kind of questions are safe to ask? Which kind of questions would scholars in this field not be very reluctant to engage with, and which ones would they kind of keep away from their research agenda?
Okay, I'd be happy to. In a way, all of this is a new field, and I want to be quite open about it. So, for example, the Journal of the European Association for Chinese Studies, they started their journal just a couple of years ago, and for the very first issue, they dealt with the issue of censorship, and they had more than 50 submissions for papers, and then they noticed that no one had submitted a proposal for self-censorship in Western academia. And so a lot of scholars were quite happy to talk about the problem of self-censorship in China, but oddly enough, no one wanted to speak about self-censorship in our own field. Now, and this is, I think, really important, because for academics, it's of course very problematic, or even embarrassing to say, to put their hand up and say, yes, I have self-censored, because that would undermine our view that we're seen as professionals. Perhaps members of the public would say, but doesn't that kind of cheapen your scholarship? And so it's not surprising that very few people would openly admit self-censorship. But I think the discussions in the past couple of years have shown that it is, of course, happening. There can be good reasons for that. For example, if you want to protect yourself or your loved ones, or perhaps cooperation partners, it can be legitimate self-censorship. However, for the entire field, it can create a really big problem. And I think here I would like to explain this, with the traffic light metaphor. So think of a traffic light, the red, the yellow, and the green. And so the red would symbolize really sensitive research on, let's say, high-level corruption in the Politburo Standing Committee, the lack of democratic political legitimacy of the party, human rights cases, things like that. You know that if you deal with these issues, you may get onto the radar, you may get unwanted attention, therefore it's risky. Now, before I get to the yellow, the green is, let's say, it's research that is very much in line with the party. Let's say you talk about soft power, and you think Confucius Institutes are brilliant vehicles to promote, I don't know, people-to-people relations. You emphasize the good things that are also, of course, happening in China. But that kind of research is then, let's say, the green type of research. Now, if I may quantify based on my totally subjective and unscientific, of course, view, a very small minority of scholars actually deal with the thorny issues for reasons that we can discuss, because the censorship is real, the kind of threats that we're facing are also real. Therefore, it should not surprise anyone that very few people do the red kind of research. Perhaps a few more the green kind of scholarship. But so if, let's say, 5% do the red, 10% are more in the green camp, then you still have, let's say, 85% of scholars who are in the middle, the yellow kind of spectrum. And that is kind of research on China that is kind of critical, where occasionally one critiques, let's say, the welcome, the problem of the wealth gap or environmental problems, etc. But it's kind of research that is still acceptable for the Chinese Communist Party. And there's nothing wrong with that research. Don't get me wrong. I'm not kind of trying to judge here by using this metaphor. But what I would like to kind of hone in on is that we don't have like a 33, 33, 33 kind of split. That I'm pretty sure about. So it doesn't. What I'm trying to get at is that because of the censorship and self-censorship, there is a kind of a mismatch in terms of the topics that are being covered. Not just the topics, but also, let's say, research approaches. For example, if I take great interest in sociology and anthropology, but if I was to travel to China and say, I'm going to do participatory field research, investigating, I don't know, the livelihood of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for example, in the autonomous region, that is not going to happen. That would be very dangerous to conduct research under the current circumstances, and therefore that kind of research approach is not possible. However, if I wanted to do, I don't know, research where I'm teaming up with an establishment intellectual at a prestigious Chinese university, and let's say they collect the data through some form of survey, for example, and we agree on how to use that data, then that's entirely possible. The problem, though, is then it is already sanitized. And of course, the Chinese cooperation partner would have to be even more careful in making sure that they don't cross some red lines in China. And as a consequence, then, the kind of research that comes is not, it's still kind of valuable. You can use it to a certain extent, but I would argue that it then also leads to blind spots, or to certain questions and research puzzles and research questions that are no longer asked. And then that, for the field, I would argue, is very detrimental. And if academia as a whole, or the field of China studies, loses some of its critical capacity, this has a knock-on effect, in my view, on the public discourse as well, because very often, let's say, journalists invite me to speak, I don't know, on Sky News, BBC, France, whatever, because they assume that I'm an expert in the field and therefore I should be able to say something, right? But if the field is in a way already skewed, then it should not surprise us that the kind of voices that we hear are also skewed. So you will find that there are a few scholars who are persistent critics of the regime, yeah, but in a way they're engaging in self-sacrifice because they know they're on the blacklist and they will not be able to travel to China. And then others either say, I just can't be bothered speaking, or you have people who say, oh, no, I will say positive things, and then I think for the general public, then that is a problem, because we don't get like the full spectrum of possible viewpoints and ideas when it comes to China.
I would just like to jump in on what you said, because of course there's different reasons as to why scholars would engage in one type of behavior or the other. But as one of the central elements in the framework you developed, you're talking about third-party funding. And anyway, this is a big discussion in all kinds of fields in Germany today, but also in other European countries. Obtaining third-party funding for your own research, as opposed to, let's say, funding through a research council of the state. And you kind of make this distinction. You talk about suspicious or questionable third-party funding. And one of the examples you also give when you talk about this, for example, in your paper, is the example of the Freie Universität of Berlin, which is very shocking. I don't know if a lot of people know about this specific issue, but this is I will just briefly explain it, and then I will let you respond or correct me if I'm wrong. So there was a contract between the university and at the same time, I think it was an educational ministry that said that a certain amount of money was going to be given to the university, but that they had to adhere to certain criteria. And one of these criteria was that they were going to adhere to Chinese law and an annual evaluation by China. And if they would not pass through this evaluation by the state, they would either terminate the cooperation, which, okay, but that they would have to repay the funds that they had received prior. I think this is a very shocking example of a university in Germany, like receiving this kind of money, and then you can, of course, question what this does to the researchers working in this university and perhaps having critical ideas. But you kind of set this as an exceptional, not maybe an exceptional example, but an exceptional revelation, because there's a lot of funds that universities receive, third-party funds, that they never have to disclose exactly because of academic freedom. So they're able to receive funds from third parties, and they do not have to disclose the origin of these funds in most cases. Could you detail this a little bit more? Perhaps if you know any examples of specific researchers or how this exactly came to the surface.
Yeah, here I'm immensely grateful to David Missel, who had done some investigative journalism. He had issued close to 100 freedom of information requests. But to our dismay, we found out that actually in many of the Bundesländer, the federal states in Germany, universities are exempt from FOI legislation for the reason you just mentioned. Now, that is really problematic because they should be able to just list whatever grant or gift they've been receiving from anyone, basically. This should not just be, this should be country agnostic, by the way. This should just be a good practice that we reveal, who's funding us. In English, we say, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And therefore, we know that funders have some influence. Like, there are, of course, funders who take a more like a hands-off approach and others who are more like hands-on. But let's take, the example of these Confucius Institutes, for example. They've been
Could you
funding.
perhaps clarify a little bit, Professor Fulda, what a Confucius Institute is or usually does, where we can find them? Because I don't know if everyone in the audience is aware of that.
Yes, sure. They're often likened to the Goethe Institute or the Institut Français, but they're different in a way because they're cultural and political organizations at the same time. They're also problematic the way they are structured. So in the German case, which I'm more familiar with, they are actually based on, they often are registered as civic organizations. But the way they then operate in Germany is that they form a partnership with the university. So they have a German co-director and a Chinese co-director. So this is actually very interesting because they then jointly decide, for example, on, I don't know, public talks and activities. But this creates already an incentive on the German side to care a lot about the sensitivities of the Chinese co-director, because you don't want to create a problem for him or her, right? If you were to invite me, for example, to a Confucius Institute event in Germany or any other European country, that could create a problem for the Chinese co-director, yeah? Because I'm being seen as a critic of the regime. And so they may say, okay, let's not invite Andreas. So maybe that's a test, okay? Please invite me, and then we'll see what happens. But kidding aside, I mean, the problem then is also that the layers above, in terms of the funders and the loyalties that lie, it leads to the Ministry of Education, and then the propaganda department. And they're quite open about it. Actually, this is all quite well documented. And I just often wonder, why would we actually have these institutes in Europe, in Germany, in the UK? What kind of value do they really add? Because if you're working at an East Asia department, let's say in Cologne, you can set up a webinar talking about a China-related topic. You don't need a Confucius Institute for that. You really don't. Like in Germany, you really don't need that. And therefore, we're creating this, partnership that in fact actually then institutionalizes self-censorship, which is very strange. And there are, of course, examples. So in Hamburg, they called off an event on Tiananmen in 2014. And then more recently in Duisburg-Essen, they didn't want to hold a book talk of two German journalists who had written about Xi Jinping. Now, the irony is that book wasn't actually that critical, but apparently, as we later found out, one must not speak about Xi Jinping in public. Now, again, that would be counterintuitive, because why should we accept any kind of censorship in Germany? I mean, it's a different matter if, let's say, if you're being invited to a meeting in Beijing or in Shanghai. Now, I still think we shouldn't self-censor even when being in China, but that's a different kind of situation, of course. But in Hamburg or Duisburg-Essen, there's absolutely no justification whatsoever to engage in self-censorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of sad that we're only aware of these kind of efforts as an exception, I think, almost, because probably a lot more goes on under the radar. Of course, what we're doing here is we're talking about university, and we have been talking more about individual researchers or research groups or institutions. But of course, they are not the only ones we can think of when we talk about academic freedom. This also covers students and their ability to receive certain information when they attend the university to learn. And this is also something, so on the one hand, when we talk about this third-party funding, we of course have to think also on other financial dependencies. So universities have a larger amount of students from one part of the world than from another one, and that are, let's say, tuition-based rather than freely or almost freely accessible in other parts. That's something that plays a role as well. So I was wondering, could you perhaps, because you have had this experience on the one hand coming from Cologne and from Germany, and then now being in the United Kingdom for this long period of time, could you maybe in this regard, like both for students, but also more in general, sketch for us a little bit the difference between these two almost markets of education in a way, how this plays an impact on the way students are able to talk freely, but also the way you may be able to teach freely to students.
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic, but it's also very difficult in a way for us to deal with this challenge. And so I've already mentioned, for example, this Hong Kong student. She studied in Japan, goes back to Hong Kong, is being detained under the Hong Kong national security law. Let me give you two more examples, very specific examples. Li Siqi, a graduate from Goldsmith University, she went back to China. And last year, she participated in the zero COVID protests, as many other young Chinese people did. And she was subsequently arrested. And yeah, she was only released 4 months later. Now, I should point out that Goldsmith University made the right noises, and they complained, and they apparently wrote to the Chinese embassy in London. And so perhaps that will have helped to get Li Siqi out on bail. But so this is about someone who I think in the British higher education context, we would be immensely proud of, because she has exercised what we call global citizenship. Yeah, she was courageous and she spoke up for the things that she believed in. But another example is Sophia Huang Xueqin. She's an independent journalist and Me Too activist, and she, became more well known in China after revealing some of the sexual harassment of female Chinese journalists. She also wrote about the Hong Kong popular uprising, and that got her apparently onto the radar of the security agencies, and so she was in a way at risk, a student at risk, and perhaps she was thinking she needs a bit of a breather, some time out, and so she received a Achieving Scholarship to come to the UK to study at the University of Sussex. Now, unfortunately, she never made it because she was also apprehended, and she was actually charged for state subversion, and she hasn't been released yet. And so here, these are two examples of a Chinese student who would like to come here, but can't, or a graduate who went back to China and got into difficulties. And you may wonder, what can we do for her? But okay, at least she was released on bail. Now, I'm raising these two examples because, in a way, the key problem now for us is, what do we do with the students who are already here? We have tens of thousands of international students from China, and that's wonderful. And I've been teaching them for more than 15 years. But I mean, how can I guarantee their well-being? Yeah. Now, in my case, the way I deal with this is I inform all of my students, home EU international students, about some of the legal risks, the Hong Kong national security law. So there's a video that I've produced, and people can watch it. If they don't want to take my module, then they can, of course, switch to another module. It's kind of part of the curriculum, and we discuss the kind of the dangers. But in this office, I've had conversations with Chinese students who said, Dr. Fulda, don't you think that I don't have ideas, or that somehow I am not willing to share critical ideas? But the problem is I don't know whether there could be an informer in this class. Now, to be perfectly clear on this, I don't think for a minute that China is a nation of informers. Yeah, they're not snitches, but the worry that someone may take notes and share them, let's say, with the consulate or the embassy or any other security agency, is always there. That is the environment of fear. And what it means is that very often, and I think lots of my colleagues have noticed the same, international students from China, they sit there and take in, but don't speak. Now, it could be because they struggle with the language, or there could be some intercultural communication issues. But unfortunately, and we really have to kind of do something about that, they may self-censor. So, for example, last week we had a workshop in Newcastle, and many of the very courageous participants, they spoke about this openly. They said, yes, I do self-censor. And, in terms of the research topics that I choose for my dissertation, or the kind of things that I say in class, or the kind of things that I post. But think about it. This means that although international students from China come to the UK to get, hopefully, a very good education, they're still under the shadow of the central government. And they still cannot speak freely. And they still cannot participate openly in the social media discourse. And that, to me, is unacceptable. We really need to do something about that, because that, in my view, is almost, it compromises what is often termed as the student experience. I mean, how can we say, well, tough luck, you're from China, therefore you will have to kind of live with this? I think it's completely unacceptable. And so perhaps we can talk also a little bit more about the kind of mitigating measures and strategies that we could employ to actually help our international students, because they have every right, like anyone else, to speak their mind free from fear or favor.
Yeah, I just want to also share an experience in that regard. the thing you just described of students coming and reaching out to a professor to say, I actually do have an opinion on this, but I'm not going to share them in class. That's something that also happens at the University of Ghent. And we see also there, and before we talk about maybe a way to address this at universities, or how could universities be better at offering like these kind of safe spaces where people can share, I wonder if you could say a little bit about the way maybe consulates and embassies can play a role in that, because for example, as University of Kent, we've also had an experience shared to us among the legal clinic students of a student who is of Uyghur origin, who is sometimes in very uncertain contact with family members there, and who gets approached to attend in events that are co-organized by people maybe at the consulate or the embassy, and was very afraid to, in that way, speak her mind freely among them and among other fellow students, because of the possible consequences that this could have for people even back home in this specific region. But I assume this is very similar for Chinese students or mainland China as well. So could you say something about that, or if you have experiences with students going through this?
I mean, before I talk about very specific kind of cases or challenges that we face on this front, I really need to briefly explain the United Front approach and how that kind of kicks in when we talk about this issue. You see, the Chinese Communist Party was a revolutionary underground party, which didn't have popular support initially, and they used a tactic that's called the United Front approach, and it basically distinguishes three strata. So it's the party and the supporters, which are the avant-garde. Then in the middle, you have the waverers, who are undecided whether or not they should support the party. And then you have the quote-unquote enemies. So it's based on a friend-enemy dichotomy. And the goal of the United Front work is to either isolate or destroy the enemy and to pull over the waverers to support the party. Now, this approach has always been there. It was later institutionalized by the United Front work system, and that is led by the United Front Work Department. And this is actually a huge bureaucracy which has enormous amounts of funds to make sure that any kind of political opposition to the party in China is being controlled or defeated. But it's also aimed at controlling the Chinese diaspora abroad. And so some of the research, the recent research suggests that close to $600 million have been allocated for this kind of work. And that's a lot of money that you can use to, to marshal those resources to, keep an eye on, some pesky independent scholars, Western scholars, but also, of course, the international students from China. And it's very unfortunate that after Tiananmen, after 1989, the Chinese Communist Party decided to keep tabs on the overseas Chinese community, especially international students, by setting up the so-called Chinese Students and Scholar Associations. Yes. They're called CSSAs. Now, again, I need to be, quite clear. Some of these CSSAs do provide useful services. If you're an international student from China, you may need help with, I don't know, some paperwork or finding accommodation, etc. So they do provide services of that nature. And so that's not a problem. The problem, though, is that they have been instrumentalized by the party state. And they have also served as the eyes and ears on the ground. And in Chinese, we call them 学联. And the latter political function of the CSSAs are very problematic. So our problem is not that there are Chinese student unions. We do welcome that, and we want to hear the voice from international students from China. However, we need student unions which are independent of the party state. They should not become a conduit or a vehicle of the party state, especially not one that seeks to control, for example, Chinese dissidents or people who disagree with the party state and its policies. And therefore, yeah, one of the challenges really is that there are almost no independent Chinese student unions. I understand that very recently at George Washington University, an independent student union is called actually Torch on the Potomac was established, and this made the news. And this is, I think, kind of indicative of the problem. It has only about 12 members, but they all have chosen to remain anonymous for security reasons. And when I listened to some of the discussions on Twitter where people talked about this, they said, but they will face the problem of infiltration. And they're in a way putting themselves really at risk by setting up an independent student union. But think about it, it's an independent student union at the George Washington University in the United States. And they need to muster their courage to do so. Again, this, in my view, is a scandal. So I think, if we talk a bit about mitigating measures, I do think Western universities should be much more critical when it comes to these CSSAs, for example, and really probe their links to the Chinese bi-state, maybe consulates and embassies. We should not, by default, assume that these are just any other student union.
Talking about that, so we have these student unions maybe inside that could be problematic. That could also be supporting students in a positive manner. Do you see any possibilities, or do you know of any kind of work that has been done trying to maybe formulate any good practices or guidelines that universities could follow in what they should do to offer perhaps support to even individual students? Because I can imagine you are very far from home. It is a very natural thing for students to kind of look for people that speak their language, that eat the same food, that know where to go and so on. So as to make people not really feel isolated with the difficulties they're experiencing, trying to resist some kind of pressure, and at the same time, yeah, fitting in a new place as well.
Yeah, I think we could do much more. So let me give you an example. Just last year, I was in charge of the Welcome Week at the School of Politics and International Relations, and we try to make this also more pastoral and also provide almost like life skills and support for people who transition from, let's say, high school to university. It made me think a lot about, for example, international students from China, where, for example, we could, as part of induction, we could offer a meet and greets between HomeU and international students, but I think they do that themselves. However, for example, often students from China complain that somehow maybe Western media is biased. It only hones in on the negatives when reporting about China, but it's actually not as simple as that. And so what we could do is offer a media literacy course, not just for international students, but also for HomeU students, so that we learn how to deal with media sources in a critical and self-reflexive way. I think this could be very useful. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is I once had a conversation with actually a PhD student. I think I can reveal so much. And I asked, from China, asked the PhD student, so what do you make of the popular uprising in Hong Kong? What do you think? And he said, what's happening in Hong Kong? And I said, oh, this has been going on for 3 months. And, it's in the news every day, every night. It's and then I learned one thing from this conversation, and then I asked him, so where do you get your information from? I mean, you can watch BBC or you can read The Guardian or whatnot. Turns out he only uses his app, his Chinese app, to read Chinese news. Now, not surprisingly, either the Chinese government didn't report about it or only very selectively, because it was hugely embarrassing and a big problem. Now, to me, that suggests that we have people, and this was a PhD student, so it's not an undergraduate or postgraduate student, a PhD student who would not have access. Well, he did have access, but he wouldn't use all this, information that was available to him. And I think that is problematic, because there's nothing wrong, of course, drawing on Chinese sources. However, I do think if you should have a healthy diet of media input, and how can it be that if someone comes to the UK, doesn't watch BBC or Sky or whatever is up your street, ITV, that should be part and parcel of your student experience, that you embed yourself in I don't know, British society, and you try to understand, okay, this is how they report about, I don't know, the coronation of Charles III. That is maybe not so interesting to everyone, but it's part of your learning, and but that cannot be taken for granted. And so I think what universities could do better is to say, okay, you're more than welcome to come here, and yes, you can of course have a Chinese viewpoint. You can advocate your Chinese ideas and interests, and we want to hear them. But you have to pay attention to what we are discussing here in the British context, because that's where you're living, and you're part now of this community, and so you actually should inform yourself about what's happening here.
Okay, I see that someone's raising his hand.
Yeah, can I just very quickly respond to that? Because I learned about these kind of really shocking developments during a recent roundtable in Westminster on the issue of transnational repression, and Iran came up quite a bit. And I do think, just very specifically to your question, we need clear channels for reporting intimidation and harassment to universities and law enforcement agencies. And this information should be made available to both students and staff. So this is what universities can do. We can't change the Iranian regime as a university or as a lecturer or whatever. But what we can do is provide that kind of support, that we say, okay, if you encounter this, these are the people you can talk to, and these are the numbers or emails that you can use to report, so that you get the kind of support that you need.
Thank you. In the meantime, I also saw that there were already questions in the chat, and then I will go to the people who raised their hand. I have not forgotten. A question that was asked by Selina Luvan-Grappler is, what are the measures to be taken, in your opinion, to limit this extraterritorial influence by China? And I would like to add, what are the measures to be taken? And also maybe if we can look a little bit into your mind and your experiences in the past so many years interacting with people in a position of power in the UK or perhaps in Germany. What are the measures that are perhaps already being taken to limit this influence in academia?
Yeah, I think many things can be done. So, for example, when it comes to the case of China, I do think that the values of UK higher education, especially when it comes to academic freedom, they should be projected in response to the problems that the Chinese government creates. And so this means that vice chancellors and other senior managers who, for example, meet with, let's say, the Chinese ambassador or someone from the consulate, they should always make this a topic. Let's say the Hong Kong national security law, but also the instrumentalization of student unions, etc. So making them aware that we are paying attention, and that we don't like it one iota. Or one could even go a step further. So, for example, right now the Communist Party is sending a lot of diplomats to Europe to create some goodwill and more cooperation. We could say, yes, we would be happy to cooperate, but that law that needs to go. Because we cannot cooperate under, when there's an environment of fear. So these kind of conversations really need to take place. And also, I mean, what we could do is that universities actually have an enforceable code of conduct. So, for example, I was part of the Academic Freedom and Internationalization Working Group, we developed a model code of conduct, and we think that universities should adopt that model code of conduct and then develop the kind of necessary protocols to safeguard both staff and students. So this is another possibility. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just download our model code of conduct and then tailor it to your needs. You can even do that in mainland Europe, although we're in Britain. Yeah, sorry about Brexit. But you can still nick our ideas. It's not plagiarism. It's called best practice sharing. And then work on these kind of codes of conducts and bylaws and regulations so that we up our game.
Could you perhaps give a few examples of what we would find in this code of conduct that you're clearly trying to sell to us?
Yeah, it is actually a very hard sell. So unfortunately, universities are not too keen on the model code of conduct. That's my experience, at least over the past couple of years. Not least because we were suggesting very strict transparency rules. Now, what I have come to realize is that in any industry, there's of course always, it's desirable if we regulate ourselves, self-regulation. However, if market actors are not willing to self-regulate, then state regulation is actually maybe necessary. So I think increasingly I've become more of a supporter of the strong regulatory state. I do think actually the British state or any other state for that matter should impose certain rules on universities that they have to report all of their gifts above a certain threshold or grants that they receive from autocratic countries. And so then we don't need to make that case within our institution. It just becomes like a regulation that universities have to follow.
Okay. I have another follow-up question on that, but I first want to give the floor to Weifeng Chao, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, whose hand has been lifted for quite a while now. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And again, I had the good fortune to provide some testimony to the APPG Hong Kong. That's a parliamentary group. And I spoke exactly about that, these kind of financial dependencies of British universities. And in a nutshell, my recommendation was that we need to change the funding mix. Now, I think tuition fees, unfortunately, I should say, are here to stay. But this idea of the Conservative government to marketize higher education and financialize it, I think is wrong. It's run its course. And in my view, the state does need to provide more funding to higher education. But unfortunately, I don't think we will go back to the fully funded model. So in a way, what we would need to do in the British context is to get like a better funding mix where tuition fees still exist, but maybe they are reduced and the state steps in and provides more funding. Ultimately, that's what we need. Now, whether this is going to happen, perhaps under a Labour government, I don't know, but this is something that I have advocated. And I think it would help in a way, because once we reduce dependency on one particular cohort of students where their tuition fees are being used to subsidize, let's say, our research, then I think the problem that you're describing would not go away necessarily, but it would be perhaps greatly diminished.
Thank you, Professor Fulda. Then we have another question by Olga Seran. Please go ahead, Olga.
I think I have to disclose, excellent points, by the way. I fully agree with your statement. And when it comes to the European Union, although I'm sympathetic to the European project, I'm actually more of a Eurosceptic. But let me briefly talk about the EU's view of China. Now, since 2019, the Commission has seen China in this tripartite way as a partner, competitor, and rival. Now, many thought this was a step forward, acknowledging that there are some systemic differences that we need to be mindful of, for example, pertaining to civil liberties or academic freedom. But actually, in a way, the way of thinking about China in these ways is problematic, because when it comes to academic freedom, it's actually a threat. Now, many of my colleagues now, perhaps in Germany or other places, who listen to me would say, oh no, that's horrible. Dr. Fulda is buying into the threat discourse. But I have experienced threats, threats of physical violence, death threats. Colleagues of mine, we can talk about that later, have received really nasty emails which were aimed at intimidating me. And I'm sure people in the Chinese diaspora, they have experienced far worse. So I shouldn't complain. But to CCP critics, whether they're Western European citizens or international students from China, for example, or just members of the Chinese diaspora, for many of us, the Chinese Communist Party is a threat. Now, we need to acknowledge that. So think, for example, of these quote-unquote police stations that Safeguard Defenders have recently reported about. There are quite literally, well, I think that the term police stations is a bit wrong. There are units in European countries that are used to police on our European ground. It's completely illegal. There are no agreements for that. These people should be kicked out, but we need to acknowledge that. And interestingly, these police stations were revealed by a Spanish NGO. And so you would wonder, something like that should have been picked up by our security agencies. Yeah, but yet it was an NGO that exercised leadership and pointed out that we have this problem. And so coming back to the European Union, I think there is a changing kind of mindset among leading politicians. So von der Leyen, she has recently spoken about de-risking from China. But the problem with that term is it's used as a synonym for decoupling. What it means is very much linked to the economic field and reducing dependencies, let's say raw materials or industry products, or let's say even the revenue that's generated in the Chinese market. But what it doesn't address is, for example, the problem of extraterritorial, laws that undermine our academic freedom here in Europe. You see, and so what we need to do in our conversations with high-ranking officials in Brussels and elsewhere is to really impress upon them and say, look, you cannot talk about China as a partner or even just as a competitor if you don't acknowledge these threats to our well-being.
Thank you very much. I was also wondering maybe something that is interesting for the German people in the audience. In the preparation of this talk, I've been discussing already with Professor Fulda, and something came up where we're talking of the kind of themes that cannot be discussed. So we have talked about this a little bit at the start of the conversation, and now I would like to go back to it a little bit if that's possible. This idea of certain questions are safe and certain questions need to be avoided, and there are certain themes related to international relations approach, maybe from Germany to China and the other way around, that kind of make sure that the perhaps German attitude towards this problem or this theme is different than it is in other countries. I'm talking about approaches like change through trade and dialogue and cooperation that kind of limit the way we will discuss certain themes. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and how this perhaps has evolved over time.
Okay. First of all, let me just briefly comment on the reaction of, I think, Olga, it was.
Oh, sorry,
No, I mean, because you were, I think, very polite. Maybe you were expecting for a more specific, answer in terms of, the laws and legislation that could be developed on the European level. But I have to admit, I'm not an expert on that specific, those policy points. The reason why I talked about this general, let's say, relationship between the EU and China was not to avoid your excellent question, but to point out that in a way, we're dealing with a problem in terms of our strategic culture on the European level, but also on the member state level. And this then relates to Catherine's question. And maybe I need to just very briefly define what I mean by strategic culture. And so this definition I wrote down because it's quite long. So please allow me to read this to you. Strategic culture is a number of shared beliefs, norms, and ideas within a given society that generates specific expectations about the respective community's preferences and actions in security and defense policy. Now, you could say this is not particularly relevant to our field, science policy, academic freedom, but actually it is, because I'm currently writing a book about Germany's relationship with China, and one key critique that I develop is that our strategic culture towards these autocracies, whether it's Russia or China, is inadequate. And here I can now really get to Catherine's point about the paradigms. For example, in the case of Germany, for more than 40, 50 years, many of the ideas that have informed foreign policy behavior have been very problematic. So, for example, the Social Democratic Party and Egon Bahr, they developed this idea of change through rapprochement during the Cold War. And they thought that if we have dialogue with the Eastern Bloc and the communist state, perhaps through citizen diplomacy, we can kind of promote change. The intention was good, but actually it was deeply flawed, also quite controversial at the time. But what emerged out of this paradigm of change through rapprochement was change through trade. It was a paled down version of Egon Bahr's Ostpolitik. And the thinking was even more simple, and you could say simplistic. It was basically, okay, we just need to trade with Russia or with China, and the Russians and the Chinese will become like us. And we will see a convergence of our systems. And that clearly hasn't come to pass. And with the renewed war of aggression from Russia against Ukraine, in a way, change to trade, change to rapprochement, and another variant, Steinmeier's doctrine is called rapprochement through interweaving, he called it. All of these paradigms, in a way, have been falsified. But the problem with paradigms, and this is really interesting because oftentimes practitioners, politicians, but even academics don't reflect on that. The strength of a paradigm is you can say, okay, this is how we deal with, let's say, the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, or this is, let's say, change through trade. That's the way we deal with autocracies after the Cold War. And it does give you some, a framework even for action. Yeah. However, often the assumptions that inform these paradigms are not being questioned. They're not being openly discussed. And when they are, then people get very, very uncomfortable. So, for example, Steinmeier, a former foreign minister, who was in charge of both energy and Russia policy, he basically said, okay, we can only work with Russia. We need to create this partnership for modernization, and we need to interweave our economy so much so that a war doesn't make sense. Because if Russia was to attack, I don't know, Ukraine or the NATO partners, it would hurt itself. And so the thinking was, it creates these kind of mutual interests, and therefore, if the mutual interests are just enough, there will be no war. So change to rapprochement, or however you want to call it, like rapprochement through interweaving, was aimed at peace building. But one of my colleagues, I worked at the German Council on Foreign Relations, his name is Frank Gumbach. He criticized Steinmeier. He said, but you need to be mindful that Putin will use gas as a weapon. Russia has done that many times in the past. That's a danger. So don't do Nord Stream 2 and all that. And what happened? Steinmeier was very upset because Umbach had written a piece in International Politik. And then I think a month or two later, Steinmeier replied. And he said, this is outdated thinking, Cold War thinking. We now need to have dialogue and cooperation and all that. And now in 2022, 23 now, we know that Umbach was right and Steinmeier was wrong. Now, to his credit, our now president, Steinmeier, admitted he was wrong. But Merkel, for example, hasn't. She still thinks she was in the right. Now, that is a problem, because if leading politicians do not acknowledge mistakes and don't openly discuss about their, let's say, their thinking at that time and admit that they've got it wrong, then that gives license to a lot of people to do the same. And so one of the criticisms I have in the case of Germany and its relationship with China is that that kind of attitude really inhibits learning. And it sends the completely wrong signal, because if something, if our policies fail, it can happen, but then we have to acknowledge failure and learn from our mistakes and then move on. But that's not what the Germans do. Like they have that's an impossible generalization, but a lot of Germans really feel like, oh, let's move on. It failed. So yeah, but then the problem is that attitude leads to a repeat of making, or the danger of making the same mistakes again. And I'll shut up in a minute. So we know, because of Russia and Ukraine, that we made mistakes. And many commentators now say we're making the same mistakes again when it comes to China. And that is why now we can no longer engage in what is often called a live lie. So for example, change through trade is now, many pundits used a very harsh criticism. They say it's a live lie. Yeah, then we have to deal with a live lie. But those people who subscribed to change through trade, who are socialized under this paradigm, that's a lot of like unlearning that needs to take place. It's very painful, because you will have to adjust your ideological lens. Things that you thought are correct, but now turn out to be not quite as good and useful to solving these problems. And many people say, no, without me, I don't want to learn. It's too painful. But I think as a country, as a society, we can't afford that. And that's why paradigms matter. And I think we should be talking about them much more than we do.
I don't know if Paula Reinfish in the audience wants to respond to that or has a question about it. But
it's related, Paula. Go ahead if you have a follow-up question. It's a bit related, but not too much.
No, you can ask whatever you want to.
Okay. Speaking about, thank you. Speaking about these, so this topic of things that cannot be discussed, and maybe also linked to this question of how we deal with, or how in the Western world, we are somehow also too stupid to understand the real, I would say, intentions by China and also by states like Russia. I'm always wondering, because you mentioned these 7 don't speaks that they communicated to the universities. Why does the Chinese government chooses the path of being so, I would say, openly against, for example, independent judiciary, for example, and the other case is civil society? And why do they not pretend to have an open civil society? Because if you compare it to Russia, what you've done before, I have the feeling that Russia is always more on the side of, well, we have an active civil society, or we have, they don't openly reject these values, but China does. And why is it? Why is this difference?
Okay, I could talk an hour about this, but I will keep it really short. I mean, you have to be mindful that for the Communist Party to really open up is very hard, perhaps impossible, given the kind of crimes against humanity this organization has already committed during the Civil war crimes of the PLA, but also in the 1950s, Great Leap Forward, millions of people died. The Cultural Revolution, again, it was a civilization rupture, and it led to a very traumatized society. And so once I spoke to a Chinese official, actually, in southern China, and he said, in a way, every Chinese family has been victimized. And after liberalization, democratization, the Communist Party would have to pay compensation to pretty much every family. They would never be able to do that. Now, you could say perhaps they could emulate the truth and reconciliation kind of process of South Africa, but even that would be very difficult to to pull off. And so instead, they're trying to rewrite history, and there are books written about, the amnesia that has resulted from that. But perhaps one additional comment about this hard authoritarian turn. I agree with you. If the Communist Party was smart, they could have just carried on with the charade and pretended that they were opening up like they did before. I think there are a couple of reasons why they didn't do that. Perhaps they realized that they were no longer controlling the opening up process. So you had ethnic unrest in Tibet in 2008. You had an interethnic unrest between Han Chinese and Uyghurs in 2009. You had a strengthening of the Chinese democracy movement at that time, calling for constitutional democracy. And they were worried about, let's say, color revolution. And they really don't want to lose power. Now, that doesn't excuse anything, but it explains why perhaps at one point they realized, no, we need to kind of stop this. And, I once trained Chinese scholars in Nottingham here, and I had the same feeling. I thought, like, why are you trying to censor us? Who are you to impose your ideas? That is not very healthy. But in a way, what we're seeing then as a result is what Karl Deutsch would call pathological learning. Now, some of my colleagues don't like that term, but you can perhaps think of it as destructive learning, self-destructive learning, because indeed, what Xi Jinping is doing, in my view, is incredibly damaging, because it limits feedback loops. The cracking down on civil society means that there are less kind of ways to solve problems constructively. And in a way, actually, in my view, this makes, let's say, a social revolution, a political revolution further down the line much more likely, actually. But then others disagree, and they say perhaps Xi Jinping and the CCP, they will be able to build illiberal institutions which will be able to deal with conflict. But I doubt it. And if you followed with what happened with the zero COVID protests, clearly that was a massive policy failure. And we see many other problems now, economic problems. And so I think things will get worse before they get better.
Did that answer your question, Paolo?
Yes, thank you.
Are there any more questions in the audience or from people attending online? No, I have one more thing I want to ask them. It's something I've come to think about a lot, and it's something that relates very much because I want to kind of make a shout out. Paula Rijn-Fischer and Selina Luban-Greppler, who is also in the audience, or the two people with which we're organizing these academic freedom lecture series at the University of Cologne. And it's something that kind of has run through as a red thread through all of the things we have discussed so far, but it has never been this clear to me as with this quote that you earlier shared with me, which is a quote from Albert Einstein, which is that there's a responsibility to share the things that are true. So you can relate this in different ways to the discussion we've had today, but I would like to maybe as a final word, since I feel like we're losing some of our attendees and there's no more questions from the audience, I would like to hear from you how you fill this in the relation of, I think, maybe German or British academia and the CCP. So there is this responsibility for academics to share the things that are true.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I'll first talk about how I actually recognize the importance of what Einstein says, and I have to engage in self-critique, so to speak. That's what often happens in China. In 2016, 17, 18, I was in charge of a Ford Foundation project where we looked at the effects of the overseas NGO law on both European and Chinese NGOs. And at that time, our theory, and there was a small group of consultants, was we were a bit like activists, I should admit. We were trying to kind of help European NPOs, NGOs think through how they can maybe team up and jointly push back against this very illiberal law that was affecting their operations in China, but also making it much harder for Chinese counterparts to come to Europe and collaborate. Yeah. And at one point we had a workshop in Berlin, and actually an Eastern European participant kind of criticized me. He said, "You're trying to talk about the continued opportunities for collaboration with China, but actually the law actually in a way makes it very clear, there is not much space." And I realized, and I in hindsight, I would agree to the criticism that we were overselling the remaining opportunities for collaboration. And that's not what we should do. Because in a way, if I know that it's going to be extremely hard to carry on under such a draconian law, it doesn't mean we have to give up and say, okay, we're closing shop, although many NGOs have left China by now. But at least I, as an intellectual academic, I have to be very straight with my audience. I have to say, okay, look, these are the problems, and these are the remaining kind of possibilities. And I must not kind of remain quiet about one aspect of this equation. But I think, if you apply this logic to other topics, I do think that very often I'm under the impression that academics as professionals know a lot about China, but then feel reluctant or about sharing all of the things that they know. And then that leads to a partial narrative. And that is not good for the public discourse. I think we need to be straight and totally open about the things that we have learned to consider, true in the widest sense.
Thank you very much. Is there any more people in the audience who have a very last crucial question that they want to ask? No? Okay. Then I just want to thank you very much, Professor Fulda, for making the time to talk to us.